Y'all hear me? Okay.
Yep. Go ahead, Lily, whenever you're ready.
Okay. All right. So this week we are recording our Module 6 group webinar, and the overarching theme was gender, marginalization, and girls of color. So for our first question, and whoever, if you want to kick it off, is what are the educational experiences of Black girls?
I just started with the statistics, and that came right out of the article. They make up 8%. That just to kind of speak to their overrepresentation among students who face discipline, and how they're excluded and criminalized. 14% of Black girls have received one or more out-of-school suspensions. They're the only group of girls among the various subgroups that are overrepresented in suspensions, going back to a very early age. And I thought that was pretty interesting.
So the very next line right after that is the one that I have written down. The issue affects the youngest. Black girls constitute 20% of girls enrolled in public preschool in the United States, but 54% of all preschool girls who have received an out-of-school suspension. So at the preschool level, these girls are basically being marginalized, and that just puts a bad concept in their head of, oh, I must be bad or something like that, because I mean, at the preschool level, what kid, I can't even remember any kid that I've ever known receiving school suspensions in preschool.
Yeah.
Like, that's ridiculous.
That immediately came up to me, and I was like, so what is this? Like, they're that young. It's almost like my past principal is so big on, like, especially elementary age, like, discipline should be learning. Like, what have you done wrong? That she kind of took discipline that way. Like, not like we read about it later in that article, like, not like punitive or like punishment, but like, okay, what did you do wrong? That should be discipline, and like, let's turn this into a like learning experience, not just like, this is wrong, we punish you kind of thing. So same thing, like the educational experience of Black girls. I think, well, I guess that's from the same article called Protecting Black Girls, but you know, I was reading how they're just subjected to a set of conditions that make them uniquely vulnerable to academic marginalization. And it's just even through, you know, the policies, practices, and the prevailing attitudes in the educational institutions that lead to contact between youth and the juvenile and criminal legal systems. So I did find that like the article like talks so much about how they're marginalized and how they're connected to legal systems, but I didn't feel like it gave a lot of examples. It was a lot of statistics, but that's one thing I thought the article kind of lacked in, was getting more specifics of that case.
I listened to the YouTube video about Black girls, and I was like, I got really into it, and I looked at, like, kind of took it from more of a qualitative kind of view as opposed to quantitative, and they kept talking about how like their voices were silenced. They had really poor student-teacher relationships, and like they were being victimized and just felt like completely invisible at schools. Like they were kind of like crying out, but like nobody was noticing like how they were being victimized.
Yeah.
The Q&A at the end of that video was tough. Just hearing it out of their mouths.
The one with the panel.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody have anything else for question 1? All right, so going on to question 2, it says, explain the school to prison pipeline and how Black girls are impacted. So I'll kind of, if you want me to go with this. So I learned a lot about the school to prison pipeline when I was 2 years out of college, when I was teaching in multicultural schools, and it wasn't just focused on Black girls, it was more just students of color in general. So it's kind of interesting to read that about Black girls. But in the state of Florida, where I taught, this is just a random fact. This is what we were told, 3 years ago. I was going to share that they looked at, in the state of Florida, they looked at the number of students who passed the, they call it the FCAT, in 3rd grade. And those that did not pass in 3rd grade, the reading part only, the number of students who didn't pass the reading part, they used that to predict how many jail cells they would need in the next 10 years. And it was crazy. And we sat there and like, went through the prison, like the juvenile one, which we didn't see any inmates, but like they were saying those were statistics and data that the state of Florida used to predict the school to prison pipeline. And it just like blew my mind in third grade reading scores. That's what example they used them as. So, kind of going back to that with black girls, and I think it kind of goes back to like the punishment thing. Like when the article said, like when you push black girls away from school. So if you're punishing them, if you're suspending them or make them, fear school or something, that increase the likelihood that they will experience harm. And in the vast majority of school districts, educators fear of violence from students who show disruptive behaviors leads to some type of punishment that pushes them out, which then opens them to harm of being put in prison. So it's kind of like if they're not welcomed and invited into school, then they're going to find a way out, which can then put them into prison.
Kind of like you were saying, Lily, where in the Morris, Texas is 34% of all girls who were subjected to school-based arrest. I kind of wanted more information on that, like more detail about what that looks like, because it doesn't sound good. So what does that look like in practice?
I agree. That's where I kind of stump sometimes.
And what scared me about that is like, okay, we could easily say like you can't arrest any females at school or whatever, but that's not going to make the problem go away, because in the video it said that the school to prison pipeline is not simply girls getting arrested and receiving citations at schools. Rather, it's the policies, practices, and prevailing consciousness, the biases that prevent us from seeing and responding to the traumatization of black girls. And I was like, okay, the problem is way bigger than just arrests. Like, we have so much more work to do.
It is. On the policy side, I thought it was interesting. It mentioned specifically like zero tolerance policies and like having more police presence in school and having them being more involved in discipline as being potential sources of that statistic. And then for me, the provocative thing that relates to this question was just this misrepresentation of black femininity and black feminine expression and being misunderstood as far as the stereotype of them being loud, combative, sassy, it's interesting.
Definitely. Any more comments on question 2? Okay, question 3 is, how is school discipline used to criminalize black girls? I'm kind of talking because I know I mentioned this earlier. I think it was the word that I was looking for. It's kind of, I can say it punitive. Is that how you say it? Mm-hmm. Okay. The punitive discipline. So it says, how anytime they did something wrong, or like, again, this is kind of where I go back to like, maybe if they gave a specific example, it can depend on school by school, your expectations or your rules. But the educators instead of employing empathetic discipline, which means talking to a student, how can you take it as a learning experience and change your actions? It immediately went to punitive discipline. So threatening the student or referring to her to an administrator, according to the Morris article. Therefore, making suspension rates for black and Latina girls are reduced as much. When they do these more empathetic discipline, they reduce the punishment by 75% and said how relationships matter, which again, I think it's so huge in those type of environments, is having relationships with your students. But especially when it comes to choosing in schools the type of reaction or punishment, is where you can create a lot of the criminalization.
One thing too that I pulled from the reading was this idea of misunderstanding. They don't view a lot of times black girls' combative, angry behavior as symptoms of trauma. They're not like really including their high likelihood to be exposed to trauma and stress, poverty, but the behavior just manifests itself a little bit different in a way that is perceived as antisocial and leading to more discipline.
That's what I picked up too, is that like there's this expectation that like black girls are supposed to be like super strong and like superhuman and like have it all together, and like we completely forget, like what Truman was saying, all the trauma that they could be experiencing, that we aren't like opening conversations all the time to like talk about and get to the root of like their behaviors.
For this question from the Morris text, I took the line that says they're the only group of girls among the various subgroups of students who are overrepresented in suspensions. And as I went through these questions, I kind of thought about our case study also, and just thought, because that's a very similar line is used to describe Black males in like the Los Angeles community. But anyway, it made me wonder, like, what's the best way to attack this situation? Like, should we zero in on female versus male and fix those subcategories and then branch back out? Or do we just look at it as people of color and try to attack it that way? This question like made me think a little more about, like, I'm glad we're focusing on Black girls also to better understand that piece, but at the end of the day, we're still needing to fix, if the two subgroups are the same, share the same characteristics, then what?
No, you're right, and I find the same thing. I really think one of my big ahas for this whole class is how everything ties together, and how some of those best practices and being culturally inclusive would address this, understanding, examining those biases, and understanding, and not expecting the norm to be more white-like. All goes back to addressing some of these. So as we, examine these individual groups that are having a different experience on the other end, I think a lot of best practices and the things that we need to do, hiring more teachers of color, being more sensitive, and moving away from that would help with all these areas. Including the ones we're not talking about in this conversation, like the LGBT community, things like that.
I like how you brought that up too, Shelby, about the same thing crossed my mind. If we read a lot as teachers, and especially multicultural stuff about students of color, and then if you want to break it down, you can go to Black or Hispanic. But then especially with doing this, where they're reading the webinars on Black girls, but then the case study was more on Black boys or males of color, I thought the same thing. Like, do you think researchers split this up ever and like kind of really hone in on a gender of color, and then maybe compare? The first time that kind of crossed my mind, so I don't think I've ever, all my multicultural classes, read an article where it was something specifically on Black girls, at least this specific. So it kind of goes back to the article too, the Morris article, which talks about how at least some schools go through this. School administrators in high poverty areas tend to see zero tolerance, and they use that as a punitive response. And it reminds me so much when I was in high school. I think maybe in middle school did too. And again, I kind of grew up in a rural area, but we probably fourth population students of color in my high school. So it wasn't like extremely all white, but at the same time, zero tolerance. Like I was saying that all the time, and like we would still see kind of people lashing out against that, mostly being a student of color, being like, why is it that he's talking about me and I have to defend myself, and I'm immediately suspended? So they're like, well, it's zero tolerance, and like just sometimes it just didn't make sense to the students and people at that young age. So I see the benefits of that, but you think it's going to just completely erase it all, but then I don't, and it's just like no matter what the circumstances, zero tolerance. So you're out. Fight, you're out. You go to jail, and it's just like. Sometimes I question that. Is like, is this really the best policy we should have? So I wonder if my high school still has that, because I definitely did when I was there, 10 years ago.
What kills me about the zero tolerance policy is that I know the school that I teach at, and can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I know the school I teach at, that if adults were held accountable to a zero tolerance policy, there would be no teachers left at my school, like at all. Like fighting, coming to school late, like turning things in. I don't know why we're trying to hold kids like to a higher expectation than we even hold like adults. Like that blows my mind.
Most of those zero tolerance policies, it's interesting because I don't think they're put in place. Their intention was to exacerbate this problem, because they're mostly just reactive things put in place to solve issues like violence and things like that. But they do have that side effect I think, of focusing in on one or more specific minorities and groups.
Yeah, I agree. So, Alicia, did you say that your school has zero tolerance for students?
No, our whole district, like I feel like we have the opposite end of the spectrum's issue. Like we aren't allowed to suspend any kids for anything. So, like a girl literally pepper sprayed like an entire testing like gymnasium full of kids and adults, like pepper sprayed, went crazy, and like she didn't get suspended or anything. So it's like I don't know. There has to be like support, but at the same time, like I don't believe in not having consequences. You know?
I can talk on this topic forever. I'm saying I'll stop this, but like same thing. It's like a lot of times their goal is to get out of school, to not have to go to school, so they do something stupid to then get suspended and not have to go to school, and also the parents don't care. They don't have to go home relationships. So then they're not getting education and they get what they want. But it's also like if you don't punish them, then okay, they stay at school. You still have to stay at school. You still have to learn. But like, if you don't have a consequence, like, do you learn? It's just like, oh my gosh, I could go on forever about that topic.
I'm with you.
Okay, well, we can go on to question 4, and it says, "What are the experiences of Black girls outside of school?"
I struggled with defining this one a little bit. Anyone?
I have that one of the quotes I took away was Black girls who face harsh school discipline are often struggling to overcome multiple forms of victimization as well as poverty. So basically, their experiences outside of school are just as biased and unfair as their experiences inside of school.
So I've found that, and this is like so depressing, but it talks about how Black females disproportionately are raped at 21.1% and are subjected to other forms of sexual violence, 38.2%. And then the 2 leading causes of death among Black girls ages 15 to 19 are unintentional injuries and homicide.
That's all I think.
Bleak statistics. But
I would love to know what the leading cause of death for like that age group is for like white females.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if I can find it.
I thought it was the same thing too. Like outside of school, I was just like, okay, well, their home lives or like what they're raised in when they're not in school. So that's when I kind of look at more of the statistics as well about the disproportional percentage of Black females that are raped, and then they're also subjected to other forms of sexual violence. So say it said 38.2% are Black girls who are subjected to other forms of sexual violence. So I'm like, other forms of sexual violence, so that other, the math real quick, 61% is obviously females, but like of all ages, of all colors. So like they take a solid more than 1/3 of females who go through that.
And even just like knowing that they're more likely to be like trafficked and to be in foster care, like all those things are like have such a huge impact on growing up.
All right, anyone else for question 4? All right, and last question is, how can educators create safe spaces for Black girls in school?
1 second. I'm so sorry. I didn't think I was going to find anything, but I just found something. This is a broad scope, and this is on the CDC website, but ages 15 to 19, and it says all females, so take that for what it is. So I'm sure we can kind of mentally section it off by what we already know about the Black females. But it says suicide is the second highest after unintentional injuries. So suicide ages 15 to 19. So I guess we could make a loose correlation between white females and that cause of death.
Wow.
And again, I think that just goes to your trauma they've been through.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
you're fine. Okay, guys. Last question is: how can educators create safe spaces for Black girls in school?
I just wrote down the 3 recommendations from the article.
Yeah.
What I'll do, the first one was healing-informed learning spaces. So this just goes back to trauma-informed care, and not. I think it really is like what's the source of behavior of these young ladies, and for some reason it's being misdiagnosed as being oppositional rather than a product of. I mean, it's manifesting itself as oppositional, but it's for some reason they're not seeing, and maybe that's the bias, is we're not viewing the same behavior in a white girl. How are we, handling that, and why are we applying a different set of standards to them?
I agree.
I had leading with love, guidance on career and college pathways, and curriculum. Those are some things that the article also talked about.
I think it kind of goes to same with I've really talked about a lot about unbiased curriculum for multicultural curriculum. I mean, I think that's something we talk about. Teachers of all ages is including multicultural curriculum, or at least resources, even if your curriculum is not always multicultural inclusive. And then the guidance on college and career pathways, to be back to high school again, where I had several Black girl friends, or kind of acquaintances. We weren't best friends. We'd sit together in classes and stuff, and they would talk such crap on our guidance counselors. So again, as a white girl was top of the class, I wasn't crazy over our guidance counselors with college career stuff. They would just say all the time, Black girls, how they don't care, they don't do anything for us, this, and that. I was like, well, you have to ask them, you have to put effort through. And they're like, well, we do. And so it's so funny that, I can remember that. And just kind of, that's probably my first, waking up moment at that age of kind of noticing differences in races and the treatment of things, even in my own hometown. And so whenever it said that about, hopefully starting a guidance in college career pathways for Black girls can help them, feel safe at school.
I think just to sum it up, how do you help any subgroup of students in your classroom? You have to look at them through a lens of understanding their culture. So you just kind of have to be able to know where they're coming from and, seek, answers to, we were all saying, why are they acting this way? What's the root cause of these issues? And I think, that's just how I feel I kind of approach my classroom. I try to, it's everyone has their own story, everyone's got their own identity, and how am I going to be able to approach that? Because as teachers, it's almost impossible to know every single culture through and through. So it's kind of an educational process for the teacher throughout.
I wrote down a quote, just kind of a summative quote for me was, ultimately, the extent to which we engage young people in constructing safe learning environments will determine success of efforts to reduce criminalization and school pushout. That pushout theme through this whole unit was impactful to me. As we establish such environments through empathy, equity, and dialogue, we use classroom management strategies that don't result in exclusion or signal to a student that is disposable and unwanted in school. That last line made me think about. So, and I'm with you, Lily. I am not about punitive consequences. I don't think learning happens in a punitive setting. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's an interesting, it's probably a conversation for another day. It's a big topic. But I wonder if there's research out there that talks about how punitive consequences affect groups differently.
Yeah.
So if you suspend a white kid, does he feel disposable and unwanted? I don't know. Maybe not. But clearly we're sending that message to young ladies of color that they feel disposable and unwanted. I go back to that doll test, which is a bad doll, and I look at some of those little girls, so they're getting that message. They already have that stigma for one reason or another, whether it's societal or and so through those punitive consequences, it's maybe affecting this group differently than maybe other groups that don't already have that stigma attached to them because of their appearance or their race or their gender or sexual preference.
I agree. That's such a good point, Sherman. I would do any I should probably even look into it, but I'm very curious now about if there's been a research study on how punitive responses affect maybe certain groups of people, whether color or gender. I certainly know that been me, and I did something that I made a mistake from. If I knew I was suspended for one day or ISS for one day, I would have done that would have taught me in a second. So, but I mean, again, it's just like what you're raised in. So it's definitely, I think, depends on the environment too and the students that are there.
Cool.
All right. Well, that's everything. Thanks, you guys.
Sounds good.